Welcome to Aware. We are dedicated to communicating information that inspires your positive growth and change. Are you interested in a peaceful planet? Are you interested in optimal health? Are you living with purpose? Are you enjoying your life? We realize each person can make a difference, and our mission is to empower your awareness. The choices that you make in every moment shape your life, and we encourage you to realize that you have your own answers and to always listen to your own truth. We invite you to stay aware. Hello and welcome to the Aware Show. I am Lisa Garr, and it's always my honor, my privilege to have conversations that inspire positive growth and change. Things that you might relate to or may not even realize when someone else talks about it in an interview and sparks that memory or that thought you've had in your innermost conversations with yourself. It's always validating and so fun to explore. And I get to do that today with an amazing guest. Also, if you would ever like to listen to our show on demand, the Aware Show podcast is wherever you listen to podcasts. We have hundreds and thousands of interviews on the Aware Show we've done. And I should say thousands of interviews, not hundreds of thousands. And you can always listen to that on demand. So happy to have you listen. So as we have realized and recognized, we see signs everywhere that say heroes work here. And we've talked about our medical care community being on the front lines for so long since COVID that they've reached a point of burnout. Maybe they've had extraordinary circumstances happen to themselves that they haven't gotten the attention that they needed because they know that the medical personnel is so stretched thin. Nursing is one of the highest demand jobs right now. If you want to go to school for nursing, you probably will have a job after you graduate. So it's a very high stress job. It's you have people's lives in your hands, and the stories that we saw, we just couldn't see enough of people who had their last wishes with people who couldn't even be with their families during COVID. Well, joining me is a brain surgeon who spent his life caring for the sickest of the sickest people. They have been through very, very difficult news with themselves, with their families. Dr. Garr Simonds is joining me, and he went through some of the darkest times where he had to give somebody life-altering news, and also some of the most miraculous times where he pulled somebody back from the brink of death. And he really wants to share these stories with us, and he did it in the form of a novel called Death's Pale Flag. And it's a fantastic medical and supernatural thriller with a memorable hero. So many stories that Dr. Simonds would like to share. And I appreciate you joining us today to dive into this topic of medical care and what it feels like to be in that environment. Thank you so much, by the way, for all that you do to help people.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm truly honored.
It's a calling, isn't it, Dr. Simonds, to be a medical doctor? I mean, my father was one for 40 years, and the 20 years of medical school and residency, it's got to be a calling, right?
Yeah, I think so. I hope so, because I think that would be one of the principal things sustaining people. I think if it's not, it would be very hard to just keep pressing on.
Absolutely. Exactly. And with all that you have to go through, I mean, residency alone is what, 24 hours on, 48 hours on sometimes?
Well, I don't want to tell how deep the snow was back in my day, but back in my day, it was about 100 to 110 hours in the hospital each week, up all night, every third or every other night. It's gotten a little bit better, but it's
still, I
still a
mean,
gruel.
no wonder there's burnout. And how are you supposed to be so careful with people's lives and even care after your 110th hour?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think, some of it is definitely probably a hazing. Some of it, though, I really think the concept was adversity training. You don't hold off on on practice with the Navy SEALs because the water's too cold. You put them in the ice cold water. And I think that was part of the idea, was to be able to practice your art under any circumstances, even if your dog tired. But it certainly comes at a cost.
Yes, absolutely. It does feel like you would think that would be better with the Navy SEAL rather than somebody who's slicing your brain open.
Both are very important jobs.
Brain surgery, what an incredible journey that you've been on to see the human brain, and it's just to hold it in your hands. What an experience. What was that like for you?
It was definitely an experience. Originally I was going to be, well, I was going to be a number of different types of doctors, but eventually settled on a cardiothoracic surgeon. And I was in my last month of medical school, already had a residency lined up for cardiothoracic surgery, and I saw my first brain operation. I said, "Oh my goodness, I have got to do that." So all of a sudden, I was changing horses in midstream, or pretty much at the end of the stream. So yeah, it really took my breath away, and always has, to the very last operation.
What about that, though? What about the human brain fascinated you so much? I'm just
Well,
curious.
I mean, it's everything, right? It's all that we are. It's all that there is around us. It's our art. It's our sports. It's our interactions. It's our love. It's our family. It's our beliefs. I mean, it's really everything. And there it is in this compact little organ pulsing away under you. And you can get swept away if you stop and think about what it's doing there.
I've always wondered, there's so much that happens actually in the brain and the connections in the brain, but there's also so much that happens outside of the brain. And that is hard to diagnose from your experience of brain surgery, right? That's the consciousness factor of the brain.
Oh, sure. I'm not going to pretend that I can tell you exactly what's going on there.
Well, yeah, I mean, I appreciate that, but let's go back to the factor of the burnout of the medical community around you, especially since COVID. What have you been able to witness?
Well, I think burnout really has been there all along. And certainly COVID exacerbated things. But I think it's one of those situations that was not well understood until the last 10, 15 years at most. And we just accepted certain behaviors amongst our caregivers as well. That's the way they are. Neurosurgeons particularly had a very bad reputation as being grouchy and curt and quick-tempered and short-fused and all that. And I would argue that a lot of that was burnout. We just weren't recognizing it as such. And I think, I mean, it doesn't just have to be in the medical fields, for sure. Every field has stress. We're in our kind of ultra-modern, hyper-complex existence that we have nowadays. We're all put under various sorts of stressors. But certainly the medical community felt it very strongly during COVID. We were, I think, running with the pedal to the metal. There really wasn't a lot more reserve to go.
Yeah, and especially when there really wasn't a lot of predictability. You were dealing with the ghost in the room, this invisible virus that seemed to be taking people out, that there wasn't a solution for in the beginning, and or fast enough that was, being developed with. And I think there's a lot to be said for people that, because of all the rules that got imposed during the time, that had to have their last wishes with someone that they didn't know. Yeah.
Yeah, certainly. And to your point, I think we're used to, in our society, getting everything immediately. Every piece of news, everything that happens across the world, we kind of find out instantly. And I think there was definitely a real impatience there about, we should know, we should understand this disease immediately. And the scientific community went into full action and really came up with some miracles. But we kind of looked on it as, when is this going to end? When are we going to
Right.
get to the the final the finish line on all this?
Well, you have this wonderful experience between science and miracles, science and the seen and the unseen. And I'd love to hear a little bit about your story, about how you blur those lines, or what your belief systems are between science and the unseen.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating realm to dabble in, and I think that's what I did with my book to a certain extent. I've always, I guess, had a spiritual side. I think I originally went into college thinking I was going to go into the ministry, and then ended up in biochemistry and in the very scientific world.
Huh.
And there's an interesting, I don't know, a dichotomy that goes on. It's almost as if you're going to be in the scientific world, you have to reject things that I don't know what we would call the supernatural, the paranormal, the spiritual. But I think that's a real mistake that we make. I think we put a huge amount of faith into the fact that science can explain everything. Science can get to the bottom of everything. We'll understand everything eventually. But I just use the word faith on purpose. And faith is kind of that concept of believing in something that can't be immediately demonstrated or proven. And there's so much that I think science will never reveal to us. So I don't think the two are diametrically opposed. I think they can exist together. They're both seeking the truth in many ways, and it's just coming at it from different angles. So yeah, I think it's a fascinating realm to dabble in.
I mean, I mean, that's interesting that you said you were considering the seminary, because you have I've had this conversation with my father. I mentioned he's, been a surgeon, or was a surgeon, for 40 years. And his daughter went into the metaphysical. And we used to have these conversations all the time um, about intuition, and what he was really doing was using his intuition. And you couldn't call it that necessarily, but he was also the type of person that blurred the lines a little and played comedy in the operating rooms, comedy tapes, just to make sure that the news and the environment was elevated. And years later, there is a lot of research around something like that. I think the lines are getting a little bit closer, if you will, where it's not just hard facts and hard science. I mean, that goes out around burnout as well, the burnout factor. I think that the wellness could be a good solution for something like that.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think going back to the burnout area, or to the subject, what we really have focused on in a lot of our work, I've been dealing in the burnout business, if you will, for over a decade. But really is to focus more on wellness, focus on resilience rather than on burnout. We go into a lot of what we call positive psychology, and that is, let's say they tell us 50% of physicians are burning out. Well, what are the 50% doing that aren't burning out? And it's very interesting, because it's all, if you will, soft science, what the hard scientists would call soft science. It's the idea of things like practicing gratitude, going to bed at night and thinking of 3 things that you're grateful for the day. And in actuality, when it is studied scientifically, it is shown to be very powerful in building resilience and wellness. So yeah, the interdigitation there is pretty interesting.
I love that you found science around gratitude. Yes, it
Oh,
is.
absolutely.
And so Tell me just a little bit about that. I mean, what does happen in the brain when you start to express maybe 5 things you're grateful for, maybe 10 things you're grateful for? What type of chemical reaction happens in the brain?
Well, I'm going to make it up because
Okay.
I don't think anybody can absolutely tell you that, but I'll make something up, and that is, I think one of the things to understand about the brain is there's a feeling, I think there's a general sense that at some point it's all hardwired, just like a computer. Everything gets plugged in where it's supposed to get, and then you turn it on and it does its thing and it does its thing. And if things change, if the environment changes or gets injured or something, you lose certain circuitry, but it tries to function as best it can. The reality is the brain is a remarkably dynamic organism, and even though it may not be able to create new neurons, the connections between neurons, and there are literally trillions of connections between neurons, they're constantly changing, all the way down to what we call the synaptic level, where one neuron touches another and communicates with another. But each neuron has thousands of these, and the way they communicate, it is constantly changing and responding to the environment. So I could make up a situation where we say, if you practice gratitude enough, you are strengthening various connections. You are opening up more channels between various neurons. What we know, for example, though, is, one of the things we talk about is, as you go through your days, one nice way is to build your resilience is to look for uplifts, to say to yourself, I'm going to search out a few things today that bring me joy or bring me happiness or bring me comfort or fulfillment or whatever. And we have to sometimes force ourselves to do that. In my field, we were always looking for the opposite. We were always looking for, okay, what boot's going to drop next? We're trying to anticipate the worst because it was important for our patients. But it's kind of a negative way of approaching the world. So if we said to ourselves, okay, go to work today and look for a few things today that, again, bring you fulfillment, bring you joy, that sort of thing. If you do that several days in a row, you actually train yourself, you train your brain to start doing it automatically. And at first you had to put energy into it. You had to think about it. You had to look. But after a while, it just starts appearing to you. Oh my gosh, somebody just smiled at me. Oh, that patient just thanked me. Oh, look, Mr. Jones is feeling better today. All this stuff wasn't registering before, but somehow we've opened up our brain. We've opened up the channels to actually seek it out and pull it in. It's a
Great
long
answer.
way,
I mean,
long answer.
no, I love it because I can visualize the firing and the wiring of the little neurons. And the more that it fires and wires in one direction, the more, like gratitude, the more of the same that it's creating, right? It creates more of those firing wirings or in the gratitude. Is there a like serotonin that comes with that, or is there any type of a brain chemical or a neurotransmitter that goes with that?
Yeah,
Firing?
there are certainly neurotransmitters that are involved. It comes in so many different ways, but if you get all the way down to the super microscopic, where one neuron touches another, we call those synapses. And those synapses, well, they use neurotransmitters. The way they communicate from one nerve to another is to release a chemical in this very tiny space. And that chemical hits receptors on the other side and creates a message down the next neuron. So it doesn't have to be specifically one neurochemical or another, because it depends on what synapses are being involved. But at that synapse, literally, you can strengthen how well the cells are connected. You can alter how ready the next neuron is to receive the chemicals. You can alter how quickly you gobble up the chemicals. You can alter how many times you shoot the chemicals into the synapse. So that's why I say it is a very dynamic system. It doesn't just go at a steady state all the time. It's constantly changing. And I think that, what we're saying is if you exercise it in some ways, you're going to change it, and you're going to change it in that direction.
So if you're exercising all of that you just explained in the name of gratitude or just tiny moments of gratitude, or the counter of that is if you exercise the trauma, the tragedy, the burnout, the loss, that makes that system stronger.
Exactly.
So it's really controlled with your thoughts.
Yeah, I very much would believe that that is a huge part of it. And therefore, when we go back to talking about people in healthcare, if you think about their environment, there can be an awful lot of negatives that you're exposed to. You're exposed to human suffering all the time. You're exposed to very anxious families all the time. You're exposed to, time sensitive issues, stress,
Decisions. Hmm.
decision making, constant decision making, a lot of multitasking, which the brain really is not good at. And so I think automatically there's a lot of negative networks that are being fired on all the time. And that's why I think it's really important that you're going to have to counter that. You're going to have to work on it. And it does take upfront energy. But what we advocate is if you expend that upfront energy, you get a bigger payoff in the end, if that makes any sense.
Yes, yes, it does. And it really makes you, and I love hearing this from a neurosurgeon's perspective about the truth of consciously directing your thoughts towards the solutions, towards the tiny things that make you feel good, coping mechanisms, and so forth. In that environment that you're in, how much, I just want to ask you from a patient's perspective, when the doctor says you have cancer, is there any other way to do that that could not cause that same reaction in the patient? Have you ever explored that?
Definitely. I've given a talk through the years to various audiences on what I call breaking bad news. And I tell the audience that I'm a world expert on breaking bad news, not because I'm any good at it, not because I've researched it to its nth degree, but because I've had to do it so many times.
Mm,
And my field is one of horrible news pretty much nonstop. And so I hopefully you keep your channels open and you begin to learn what seems to resonate with the families, with the patients, and what doesn't. And you're right, there seems to be some people who just come in and fire point blank, and that always felt like a not very productive way. And yet honesty is really critical as well. If you start sugarcoating things, if you back off from really delivering in the end the true situation, the patients, their families, they sense it, and then they lose trust. And the minute you lose trust, you are damaging them, because you're unable to reach them like you did. So it is a delicate walk between honesty and the actual truth behind the situation, and some compassion and some empathy and some reading the room, if you will, and feeling what they need from you at that moment, and probably breaking it up into multiple interactions.
mm.
So it's a delicate dance for sure. And if you just kind of, come stumbling in and blast your way, it's going to be damaging.
That is a double-edged sword. I can really respect and appreciate that you have to deliver difficult news. At the same time, you have to be trustworthy enough to deliver accurate news and manage expectations. And I think that contributes a lot to the burnout on the healthcare provider's perspective as well, because it is a lose-lose situation. Some do it very well, but they're no longer practicing medicine. I've noticed they write books like you.
No, there are great physicians out there, and I work a lot with medical students and pre-meds, and we have nothing to worry about the future. There are just amazing people coming in. Although I have another book that's brewing in my head, questioning whether we're burning out our docs before they even get to medical school. But that's kind of
Oh my
another
goodness.
subject. But
Mhm.
one thing I will go back to, just to address with you, because again, as you say, it's a two-edged sword. I used to have a drawer in my office desk that was full of thank you notes. And believe me, every once in a while I would dive into the drawer, which is actually a very healthy thing to do, I think, and
Great
just
idea.
read a few when I was feeling down or feeling, like I wasn't winning. But I would tell you the grand majority of those notes came from people who had terrible brain tumors, or the families of people who lost a loved one. And so there's a dynamic that goes on. I think part of being a doctor isn't just doing the technical side, doing the technical surgery. I think part of it is being able to help with the families, particularly the families and the patients in their emotional suffering. And I think if you do that well, if you can accomplish alleviating some of that suffering, there's a tremendous give back. You can
Mm,
come out of one of these really hard discussions and come out and actually feel, I don't know, warm and tingly, if you will, because you've made that human connection. You've got past everything else. You've made the connection, and you've helped them. And anytime this is one of the things that builds resilience. If
true.
you can help another human being, it's a tremendous resilience and wellness builder.
It
So,
is.
so we say, oh, it's a horrible situation. We subject people to all these things that can burn them out, but we also give doctors and nurses and all a great opportunity to to get those warm tinglies as well.
That's true. I mean, maybe that's also why you do it. That's maybe what that calling is all about, is that you can impact another life, that you can save somebody's life. And that's, you are literally in the captain's seat with that. With, doctors have the red capes in many, many instances they do. Um, so I have a question about just to go back to the whole burnout thing, and that you
Mhm.
have told this story a little bit. I want to hear about your level of burnout and what that might have caused you to see or to do, and what you discovered was possible in the brain.
Are you saying my personal
Yeah,
burnout?
yeah,
Oh
your
no, I
personal
was
story.
perfect. I never had a problem ever. No, and here's another thing I think that's important to understand, at least in the way I picture it. I don't see burnout as a all or nothing situation, and I don't see it as a condition that once you have it forever.
Mm,
I think we all probably have an element of burnout, particularly, as I said, in our crazy society. And I think it goes up and down and up and down. And one of the ways that I've been taught to think of it is to look on it as we all have kind of a bank of psychic energy, if you will, within us. And we are constantly either withdrawing from the bank to deal with that person who snapped at us today, or because my wife forgot to I don't know, bring home the dry cleaning, or I don't know, but withdraw from the bank. or you can make deposits in the bank through a pleasant interaction, through meditation, through looking outside the window and seeing, the green trees and the birds flying around. So we're constantly either withdrawing or depositing in that bank. And burnout somewhere, there's a line somewhere there where we're losing money, or we're
You're
losing
overdrawn.
energy, we're
Mm-hmm.
overdrawn. Thank you. That's the perfect
Mm-hmm.
a way to look at it. And we're not replenishing it at a rate that's going to refill it. And so now everything becomes a drag. It's hard to get out of bed. It's hard to move. It's hard to get motivated. We feel no empathy for others. We don't feel empathy for ourselves. We feel like everything we're doing just isn't contributing. And I would be lying if I said that never happened to me.
Yeah.
Where it all came to a point for me was when I was burnt out enough, I think, to believe that all my people were bad people. Now, so let me explain that a little bit better. I was the chief of neurosurgery on my team at Virginia Tech, Carilion Clinic. And so I had a big team under me, a bunch of neurosurgeons, a bunch of PAs, a bunch of residents, all that sort of thing. And I got to the point where I didn't like them very much. I was getting all sorts of complaints about them. And I was like, I don't like these people. What is wrong with them? And of course, I was just as guilty as the rest of them for being a typical neurosurgeon, brusque, snapping, marching around the place like I owned it, snapping at nurses and assuming everybody had to know everything. Anyway,
That's typical.
that's pretty typical. That would be the stereotypic neurosurgeon, at least. And at some point I was like, I have to fire everybody or find a better way. And it just by happenstance, I ran into a world expert on physician burnout. And we got talking, and eventually I got him to spend time with my team, and we just kind of built out from there. We ended up writing 3 books together on burnout and healthcare, and obviously the novel really circles around the subject as well.
Well, I think that's fascinating. When you go around and you are inside people's brains and you have that skill that you fine-tuned, I can understand that the your model of the world must have, and other neurosurgeons must exist in such a detailed matter that when they go to the macro, it would be very, very difficult to deal with that when you're dealing with such the micro level of your view of the world. And that gap has got to be very difficult to make. Is that why?
I mean, I think we love to think of ourselves as special. I think I don't think we're all that special, but boy, did we get a lot of training. So, I mean, I think we can take any well-motivated, caring person, and if you give them 11 years of training to do something, they're probably going to be pretty good at it. But yeah, you begin to believe yourself, believe in yourself and believe that you are kind of special. And it's interesting. I did all sorts of studies on my team once we got into the burnout business. So at one point I had them detail or diary their feelings, their thoughts about anything when they got out into the outside world, when they weren't in the halls of the hospital, and they got out into the outside world, and went to, I said, okay, go to a restaurant and just diary what what kind of feelings you have. And it was interesting because it echoed some of the things you were saying. They found themselves remarkably impatient because people weren't precise. People weren't, right on top of things. People were taking too long to make decisions. People, so because it wasn't a fine, a moving Swiss watch, they were getting super frustrated and upset. So yeah, they were projecting their world onto the outside world. So it was very interesting.
Yes, yes. I know a few amazing doctors, and where the way they do one thing is the way they do everything. It's like precision in surgery, and then precision in their hobbies, and precision with their families, and it's everywhere in their lives. Have you ever looked at the benefits of meditation? We talked about gratitude, but what about actual stillness?
Yeah, absolutely, on multiple levels. So we experimented a lot with our team, and had lots of different discussions and methodologies for several years. We ran through all sorts of different strategies in seeing what helped each individual with their resilience and their wellness. And one thing that's very interesting is certainly it feels like in that world, one size doesn't fit all. What resonates with one person won't with another. So we would do mindfulness exercises and meditation and yoga and all sorts of different methodologies to see. And it was interesting to watch because some people really found peace with it and other people just couldn't shift the gears into it. Now, part of that is we did a lot of these exercises still in the hospital, and I think some of it we needed to escape. But absolutely, we even ran some studies on mindfulness and meditation. For example, just before going into an operation, just doing just a minute of meditation and seeing if that had some positive response. And in a very small study, it did have a positive response. So yeah.
That's so fascinating. So on either side of this conversation, mindfulness can definitely cause the stillness, but the burnout can cause almost a mental breakdown or psychotic type of behavior or lack of tolerance or a superiority complex. Did that happen to you? Did you get to a point of burnout that you had, in your book, you talk about seeing ghosts?
Yeah, I did not personally see ghosts, thankfully. In the book, the protagonist goes that far, and I wanted to play with that idea as to whether the ghosts were real or not. It goes back to our science versus spirituality,
Mystical,
if you will,
yes.
and or discussion. But no, I don't think I ever got that far, but boy, I certainly transposed a lot of my behaviors and for example, to the outside world. I think I was not always the most pleasant of fathers. For example, I have three young sons, or I had three young sons, and I think I could come home and be rather intense. I couldn't downshift out of the intensity at the hospital. For example, I might come home and I'd notice that one of my sons was looking glum, and I'd say, "So Colin, what seems to be the problem? Why are you looking so bummed out?" And they might say, "Oh, I just broke up with my girlfriend." And my immediate response would be, "Well, at least you're not lying up in the ICU in a coma like several other teenagers are right now." And that's a very poor response.
Yeah, it's like, I don't see you, I don't hear you.
Right, exactly.
But you don't do that intentionally. I mean, obviously. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think, for example, what I was doing was, and the protagonist in the book certainly did, was using the family as an ICU for themselves. You know, I get home and say, okay, repair me so I can go back into battle the next day.
Or substance abuse, alcohol, whatever the other coping mechanisms could have been.
There is a lot of that, and we certainly see a lot of that in medicine. Another thing I think that is very big is what we would call the self-denial to overindulgence cycle, where you self-deny, I can't do that, I'm going to work longer hours, I'm going to work, and when you finally get a break, you dive into some indulgence way too far, to the point of it being unhealthy. And it could be unhealthy indulgences like drinking too much or drugs, or driving too fast, or I mean, there's a million things that you can do that are automatically unhealthy. But we'd even see it with healthy behaviors. Like, yes, going to a gym is good, but going
Exercise,
to a
yeah.
gym and destroying yourself is probably not so good.
Right. It's the same pattern. It's the same obsessive compulsive pattern.
Exactly.
What about where you're talking about having like a clinical mental break in the state of burnout? Have you seen that?
Yeah, I think there it's not well worked out, but it's clear that burnout in a severe state is going to start plunging into other significant psychological illnesses. Whether the seeds were already there or burnout leads directly, it's not clear. But there's and luckily, in the burnout sphere, it's probably only a small percent. Oh, I don't know how to turn that off. I don't know if that's
No,
going
you're
to help.
okay. I didn't
Okay,
hear anything.
sorry.
Yeah.
Um,
Uh,
but
in the
they
burnout state, it's a small percent of.
that are really disabled by it, that are just completely wiped out, unable to take that next step. And I would say they're at the highest risk of this falling into a fulminating true depression, or even worse, rolling into a psychosis.
Hmm.
So I luckily that I don't think that's going to be large in numbers, but that's certainly a risk, and it needs to be attended to. And I think the other thing is, even without that, what we're saying is these behaviors that start to come out when somebody's burned out is just miserable. It's miserable for the person, but it's also miserable for their friends, their families, their coworkers. And I would say that it spreads like ripples in a pond. If you plunk somebody who's really burned out in the middle of a group, that group is going to get worse itself. Negative emotions spread very rapidly, as does positive emotions. So, and this has been shown too, this has been studied. But if you put burnt out people on a team, it's more likely that entire team is going to trend towards burnout.
This is for more than just medical professional. This is for anyone who's in a high burnout job or sitting in front of Zoom too long on
I
their
think it's
computers.
all of us.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And then the irritability goes up, and then the body isn't taken care of, and there's so many symptoms. I'm just curious from a brain surgeon's perspective, have you ever seen a brain with legitimate mental illness?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose so. We certainly have operated on many people with mental illnesses, usually for something other than the mental illness. Uh, and interestingly, most times it looks pretty much the same.
Hmm.
We see it at a very macroscopic level. Now, there are studies of various mental illnesses MRI studies and stuff, and particularly when you get into functional MRIs where you can potentially see differences. But boy, when you open up a skull and you look inside, they all look pretty similar,
They all have
which is, I guess that's another lesson, though, is, the way we judge people and the way we are so intolerant of various people. I think, when you open up and look at the brain, they all look the same.
really. Is it this kind of gelatinous gray matter like they explain? I mean, most of us have never seen a human brain.
Yeah, I try to, the consistency I try to describe as kind of like overcooked pasta. It holds together, but it's kind of soft and mushy. It is very vascular, so there's a lot of little blood vessels that you'll see on the surface. Now, why that's important is if you cut it, it bleeds like heck. It's a small organ compared to the rest of your body, but it demands 20% of all your blood supply. So it's very very selfish about blood supply because it needs oxygen and it needs glucose all the time.
Yes, absolutely. And what about fat? I mean, is there a certain percentage of fat in the brain?
No, and the reason for that, even though we call somebody a fathead or something, the reason for that is it's, when it was put together by whoever or however, it's really tried to keep as much space for nerve cells as it possibly could. So it doesn't use fat. It doesn't use a substance called glycogen as well, which are both energy storage chemicals. And that's why it needs that constant supply, because if it doesn't have a constant supply of oxygen and glucose, it doesn't have enough energy to keep the neurons firing. And within a few minutes, they will shut down and you go into coma.
Oh, goodness, yes. I have low blood sugar issues and it's just there's no precursor. It just plummets and I'm stupid.
Yeah, it's amazing how things
Yes.
start to shut down, isn't it? And
Yeah.
you definitely don't process like you would.
Yes, I know. It's very interesting. I mean, it's a whole thing, hypoglycemia, but you got to keep, it's just controlled through food and so forth, which is just as wonderful, and exercise. And so you're really validating the whole exercise theory that oxygen restores the brain just as fast as anything. Hmm.
Yeah, we know that exercise, all these things we keep telling ourselves that are healthy, and all these things that we keep telling ourselves are unhealthy, they're pretty much on the mark, in terms of brain health, at least.
Blueberries, walnuts. I mean, I got to ask because
Absolutely. Absolutely. There are reasons for that. And on the flip side, for example, we know things like just social isolation is remarkably harmful for the brain on multiple levels. It even increases your chances of Alzheimer's, for example, in the long run. So in the short run and in the long run, just social isolation and not getting exercise and being stressed all the time and not getting sleep are all potentially harmful.
How does that work? How does social isolation correlate with Alzheimer's? I'm so curious.
Well, I think, it gets back to what we were talking about. It is an organ that really responds to being used. And all these little connections, these trillions of connections, depend on constant stimulation, if you will, of one form or the other. And so if we're isolating ourselves, if we're not getting a lot of input, if we're not making our brain work, it won't, and it will start ditching various connections, and therefore what we feel is it really starts cutting down on the overall reserve. And so then when you get a disease, and you get older, that's already going after some of your reserves. So if you've already cut your reserve way back, and then you just meet the normal aging process or any other diseases that you encounter, there's just less to fall back on.
That makes a lot of sense. And it's like we were talking about earlier, the more you do something, the more that the brain adapts to what you're doing. So if it's gratitude or if it's stress, it's going to continue to build and grow those particular connections. Um, what about downtime? What about sleep? What about, because everyone says sleep is amazing for the brain. How is that if there's not a lot of circulation happening at the time?
Well, it's interesting. I was just on, I know it's I don't want to burden you with my suffering, but I just got back from Switzerland, where
Oh,
we just
no, my
spent.
daughter lives there. That's amazing.
Where in Switzerland?
She's in Champagne,
I
about an hour from Lausanne, between Lausanne and Geneva.
We were down on the Italy border, but it was for Virginia Tech. We ran a neuroscience course there, but I got talking with the other neuroscientists there, just about sleep. Why aren't we doing even more research than we are? Because it's such a big part of our lives, and so there's a lot about sleep that we really don't understand. We think that it's used partially, at least, for a period of kind of cleaning out toxins and bad chemicals out of the brain. But we also know it's gets involved in consolidation of things like memory and that sort of thing. So it seems like a very necessary part, and there's all sorts of theories, but boy, they are not well fleshed out. So I'm not gonna tell you that I know exactly what role it's playing. For example, I'd love to know what the dreams are doing, what
I,
dreams are really doing for us.
I know there's so much I could ask you too. I mean, I'd love to know about the supplementation and if the neurotropics really help. Does caffeine help because it increases circulation? Does it harm it? And just answer that one for me, would you? Because I love caffeine.
The wonderful things about things like that question is, all you have to do is wait around a few years and you'll get the opposite answer. So right now, caffeine
Oh,
is kind of in,
yes.
but
Then
it
it's
may
going to
be
be
out
red
in a few
wine is
years.
in, red wine's out.
Red wine is a little out right now, so which is
Blueberries, though, blueberries and walnuts, they pretty
blueberries is
much
they seem to stay on.
they do. Quick question, and I know this isn't quick, but is so when I had my accident and I hit my head on this rock and shattered my helmet, I went to a place that I remember indelibly like it was yesterday. And it was almost like my conscious thinking brain was knocked offline and I was pure consciousness. Like I was the pure experience of being without any boundaries. I got to experience what it was like to live in a boundaryless, seamless universe between anything that exists, including your desires. And I am wondering what part of my brain got knocked offline to be able to experience that seamless oneness.
Yeah, I mean, you we're re-entering a discussion we were having earlier in some ways, because there is this duality, and I just wrote somewhere, I can't remember for what, it was some little article, but anyway, I think even the highest trained brain scientists often are dualists, where we want to at least believe that we're more than just these firings of neurons and neurochemicals and that sort of thing. So what the heck is going on there? And maybe we're just turning off, the main consciousness centers where we know approximately where they are and how they kind of light up the brain. I talk about it like being a computer where we have kind of on-off switches, and the mainframe is still there, and but we can kind of turn it on or off with a series of switches. But I had something similar. I had a really serious neurological disease quite a few years ago, where I was pretty disabled. My wife said I looked like my mother at her worst stage of Alzheimer's. I was pretty much laid out. It was called acute disseminated encephalomyelitis. But I remember during that period, even though I wasn't communicating and doing anything, being in there and thinking about, oh, what are the ramifications of this? What's going to happen to my family? All that sort of thing. Even though, so much of my brain was shut down. So the long and short of it is, I don't have the answer. Why are we able to do that? I would just celebrate it that you were able to do that. And, what we know is the brain in all its magnificence, it's filtering out a lot of what's going on around us. We don't see infrared, we don't see ultraviolet, for example. There's so much of our environment that is filtered out. The brain wants to simplify it for us so that we can manage ourselves day to day. So there's a lot of circuitry, and there's a lot of overload that just is taking stuff away. And maybe by kind of disinhibiting that, we're allowing other parts to open themselves up. I don't know.
I agree with you. I mean, maybe that bundle got so much in my brain, so much circulation and neuron firing, that's why it's such an indelible memory for me. I'm just curious, how did you get over the neurological disorder?
By luck.
Wow.
The disease is kind of like multiple sclerosis in that your own body's immune system attacks the insulation of your nerves. And that insulation of your nerves is actually really important. It speeds up the transmission of messages from one nerve to another. So if that's not there, if the insulation isn't there, you won't work. Nothing works, because it all depends on split-second timing. In multiple sclerosis, it attacks little spots in your brain and spinal cord at a time. In ADEM, it occurs all at once. But if you're lucky and you don't die, the brain starts to re-insulate the wiring. And it literally starts putting the insulation back on the wiring. So things started slowly turning back on. It went over many months. I had to kind of learn to walk again and read again. I couldn't read. I mean, I couldn't do anything. So I lucked out, because my field is pretty high precision, and I was pretty sure I'd never get back to that. But I was able to go back, spend another, I don't know, almost 20 years doing it.
Oh my goodness, what a story. What an incredible story. Well, the stories over and over again, you show me that healing is possible, that resilience is located in the brain, and burnout is a real thing, but you have to balance it with mindfulness, with even the simple technique of gratitude, and that can actually change the brain alignment. I think this is so fascinating. Thank you so much. To really hear all of this from a neurosurgeon's perspective is fascinating for me. So thank you very much for this conversation. I've learned a lot, and I appreciate you, all that you've shared. And the book, the wonderful novel style book that you have, it's kind of a fiction style book that's out there, is called Death's Pale Flag, among many other books that Dr. Simonds has written. So thank you so much for being with me today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, absolutely. It's a delightful discussion. I'm very much in your gratitude.
Thank you. And I am Lisa Garr, and until next time, I invite you to stay aware.